Hello everybody, welcome to the asynchronous lecture. The lecture for today is the problem with objectivity. We're going to be deconstructing or challenging this framework as a cultural worldview. And for class today, you read a short article or chapter from Bell Hooks and another article about from Emily Martin about the science of and representation of fertilization. And so the question that we're getting at through these readings, right, is what is objectivity? How does this cultural framework shape scientific research? And what are some alternative ways about thinking about scientific inquiry or humanistic inquiry in a way that can really break past the problems and limitations with this cultural model? So Emily Martin is a anthropologist of medical practices. You saw a little bit of that in her article, right, where she talks about how egg and sperms are represented within textbooks and how these representations are shaped by our understanding about quote unquote traditional gender roles, passivity and activity. As well as, and the ways in which these representations then inform our assumptions, right? Because we learn, we all have an idea of what reproduction is that we really get from these textbooks that are influenced by these really sexist and heteronormative ideologies. But then they can also inform scientific inquiry, right? These cultural frameworks actually can shape the kinds of questions that that scientists ask. The questions they think are reasonable and worth asking, and the questions they don't ask. And one of Emily Martin's more subtle points, right, is that recent research has really focused on the ways in which the egg actually plays an active role in selecting sperm and fertilization. And this was a whole area that was not studied prior to pretty recently, because the cultural assumption was eggs are feminine, thus passive. And so Emily Martin is really interested in how gender ideologies get inscribed into our bodies, get inscribed into our understandings of biological processes. And a lot of students really struggle with this. I don't know if this will be an issue in Agnes Scott or not, but a lot of students really question this article because they say it just seems like she's going too far, right? Like egg and sperm, that's just biology. That's just nature, right? Those aren't, to kind of try and stake out a feminist claim about these things, that's not reasonable, right? That's just taking feminism too far. Because again, this is just nature. This is just our biology. This is just the way eggs and the sperm work. And if you have that question, just hold on to it and keep thinking through it. And the question I would encourage you to ask yourself is, why do you think that it's just biology that the egg is passive and the sperm is active? Where did you get this idea? Who told you? Where does this idea come from? Who taught it to you? The second reading is by Bell Hooks, who is not an anthropologist, but a cultural critic. And she's really helping us get at another kind of way of thinking about how we can do research in a way that's really grounded, that really accounts for the ways in which our social positions, our different experiences and orientations as human beings are on the one hand structured by these systematic social systems, which she would call white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, as well as the different kinds of vantage points that we might occupy within these systems and how different vantage points can help us ask new questions and see new things. And this really comes out of her work thinking about the history of feminist thought and feminist politics. And she's really interested in this history whereby feminism becomes mainstream, especially in the 1980s. It becomes more mainstream, and part of that process, right, is by putting specifically white feminist perspectives in the center. And feminists of color and womanists get placed on the margins, right? So she's really interested in this language of centers and margins as a way of thinking through multiple intersecting axes of oppression and the different ways that these social structures shape our perspective, shape our worldview, shape the kind of questions we think to ask and the issues we think to engage with. And so what I assigned her for, right, is to give us a way of thinking about using this language of margins and sinners, a way of thinking about power, a way of thinking about anthropology, and what I've been calling in previous classes the view from below, in a way that provides a real alternative to this cultural model of objectivity, that instead of foregrounding this idealized vision of being unbiased and neutral, instead tries to account for how our politics and how our experiences, how our place within social systems shapes our perspectives. So I've said this a few times already, right? Objectivity is not an objective framework. It is a cultural worldview. And so I want to talk about it as a cultural framework, right? As a cultural worldview or mythology. And so when we think about objectivity, really what we're talking about is a dichotomy between objectivity on the one hand and subjectivity. And these are concepts that really organize how we think about the world in a deep way, right? We often take them for granted. We take them to be neutral descriptions of the world. We try and make our perspectives more objective because we tend to view that as better. And we try and eliminate, we try and be, especially in school, right, less subjective. Or alternatively, we might say, actually, subjectivity is really important. We need that subjective perspective too. But the problem, even with that counter-narrative, is it continues to reinforce this underlying cultural dichotomy between objectivity and subjectivity. False dichotomy. So my argument, right, is that this dichotomy between objectivity on the one hand and subjectivity on the other hand is a false one. It's misleading. It actually gets in the way of our ability to understand the world, and especially social dynamics. And the reason for this, right, is we have to look at the kinds of core assumptions underlying this dichotomy. The idea that objectivity is, this idealized vision that we might inhabit, that we might view the world from a position that's totally separate from the world, that's uninfluenced by what we're observing, that doesn't influence what we're observing back, that is unbiased, right, as if we didn't have our own perspectives, right, and it's just not real, right, because the assumption is that we can view the world from outside of it. And I don't know if you've ever tried to view the world from outside of it, but I have never successfully managed to do that in my entire life. It's incredibly difficult, right? And so I'm going to kind of keep unpacking this, right, to kind of illustrate the kinds of absurd and arbitrary claims or assumptions that we have to make that underline this kind of core dichotomy. So instead of claiming to or trying to be quote unquote unbiased, trying to approach the world without values in a kind of disembodied way, rather I'd like to talk about culture as intersubjective, meaning it's something that's communicated communicated between persons. It's neither wholly objective or subjective. It's both. It's it's communicated, it's in our minds, it shapes how we think, it shapes how we act, it shapes how we talk, and we learn it from other people. It's something that really exists by virtue not of our own subjective experience or an objective reality, but by virtue of our relationships with others. And this is a radically different way of thinking about the world and thinking about what it means to know something as a social scientist, right? Because to foreground this idea that we know the world from within relationships really is at odds with this mythology of this illusion of objectivity. So one of the points that a lot of feminist critiques have made of this idea of objectivity, right, is they describe it as a quote-unquote view from nowhere. So I give you the Eye of Sauron if you're into Lord of the Rings, right? This is how I think of it, right? It's this kind of disembodied eye that just views the world from on high. The idea being, right, that to be objective, again, you have to be outside of the world. You can't be participating in it. You can't be interacting things. You can't be interacting with things. You have to be a disembodied I. And the problem is that we have bodies and that we know the world by virtue of our interactions with it. We can't separate ourselves from the world because that's an inherently that's an inherently non-objective way of thinking about the world. So this is, again, what I mean by the idea that objectivity is inherently not objective. There's no reality to this idea that we can view the world as disembodied eyes. And some scholars, like Donna Haraway, who is another scholar who studies the history of scientific thought, she calls this idea of the view from nowhere the God trick, right? And the idea is that if you if you look at the history of science, right, what happens when you see this shift towards philosophers talking about objectivity as a kind of guideline for good knowledge, essentially what they end up doing is they replace God, this older idea of God, maybe older is not the right word, but this idea of God with man, right? So instead of having God viewing the world from on high as a kind of omnipresent observer, you have man studying the world, viewing the world from a kind of disembodied, omnipotent location. And if you look at Enlightenment philosophy, this language of man is actually really appropriate because they're talking about men. And you can look at famous Enlightenment scholars like John Locke, who I think y'all have probably heard of in high school or something, right, as a famous philosopher who really provides a lot of the ways we think about the world, think about capitalism, think about the nature of nature. But if you look at his writing, one of the kinds of ways he articulates what it means to have good objective knowledge is this idea that young men need to learn to move beyond these just so stories, these superstitions that are taught to them largely by black women caretakers, right? So the way he thinks about these things, he's implicitly positioning the objective knower as white, landed and wealthy, and a man. And in order to achieve objective knowledge, they need to break from forms of knowledge, ways of knowing, or ideas that are seen as, that are associated with colonized people, with black people, with service labor or servant labor or slave labor, and with women. And so this idea, right, there's this deep political history of this idea of objectivity, as well as a kind of theological history, right, that really takes this Christian concept of God, which is very different than, for example, how I as a Jew think about God. And then, or like some of the Greek folks I work with who have a very different, they wouldn't even use the word God. They would say like creator, or they might talk about like creation or the kinds of forces that animate life, but they're not necessarily concerned so much with what we would call God. Anyway, right, my point is, this is a very actually Christian framework that then gets represented as if it was secular, as if it was representing a kind of inherent neutral, culturally neutral reality. And so here I've kind of created a shitpost for you about what knowledge, what objectivity is supposed to look like. What is this model? And I'm using anthropology as an example. We're focusing on social relationships. I have my space lady, right, who is because she's from the future and objective and disembodied and stuff. I mean, she's not disembodied, but we'll go with it. And she's observing interaction from my shark friend from last week with this person over here. They're being social, they're doing culture. And the researcher is working on knowing them from an objective location, from an objective standpoint. And I've drawn this kind of this barrier between the knower and the known, right? Because this is the idea that the knower is not supposed to have, the knower is not supposed to influence what they're studying. They're not supposed to interact with it. They're not supposed to be influenced by it beyond just observing it from a very distant location. And again, the kind of underlying assumption is that we know things from distance. We know things best from a distance, which is very different from a kind of alternative, which is we know things from specific social locations within larger structures, or we know things by virtue of our relationships, right? These are these are different ways of thinking about what it is to know something in a good way. What's good knowledge? Another aspect, right, is that knowledge is supposed to go one way. The knower observes the known, but the known isn't supposed to talk back. That's just not realistic, That's not the way people are. And actually, even though I framed this idea as a kind of analysis of a social situation, being social and doing culture, this actually doesn't work for quantum physics either. Because the reality is, right, we have to know things through interactions. We can't know things from behind a force field or what's the word I'm looking for? Behind a force field or from a disembodied position of like the all-seeing eye. Instead, even like for technoscientific studies, right, you know things by virtue of these elaborate technological and social systems, laboratories and universities, funding systems, down to like Geiger counters and machinery, right, all of which provide mechanisms and very organized, socially and systematically organized mechanisms for interacting with things from the scale of exoplanets to whatever the word I'm looking for, to quantum phenomena. On that note, one more point, right? I alluded to this last week, but why does PowerPoint have a 3D avatar of a person in a shark costume, but no black and brown people, right? So again, even as I try to communicate these ideas to you, I'm constrained by a specific technological assemblage, right? PowerPoint, my computer, that reflects and is shaped by cultural ideologies and systems and inequalities. There's no knowledge that exists outside of our social systems. We're always working within these structures. Because we're human, right? And scientists are inherently human beings, which means they're social. We know things by virtue. We have to exist in the world, right? We have no other choice. There's no other way to know the world except from our existence within it. So I feel a little ridiculous, right? But here are the underlying points that I'm making. What are the problems with objectivity? People are not disembodied eyes. They have bodies. Okay, so that's kind of ridiculous, but that really taking that seriously demands we rethink these kinds of ways we've been habitualized into thinking about what is good knowledge that are really indoctrinated into us through things like high school. Thinking about how do these frameworks, these ideas about knowledge and research reflect a particular social history rooted in colonization and white supremacy and patriarchy, as well as how do they continue to reproduce this kind of, who has the privilege of being able to assume this kind of position where there's taken to be, their perspective is assumed to be value neutral, right? Who doesn't have that privilege? And we can go back to Mendoza Denton's argument, her book, right, where she talks about people kind of saying questioning her ability to be a serious researcher because she's too much of an insider, or assuming that she's from LA or whatever it was, right? And this idea is really deeply ingrained that good knowledge has to remove itself from our lived experiences as if that was a possible thing. And so, of course, Mendoza-Denton, as a Latinx person, is not afforded the privilege of that objective standpoint. She's not considered to just have it in the same way that her peers might. And this is, of course, a really common phenomenon. You talk to my friend Irtifa, and she talks about this too sometimes, the ways in which she's assumed to be less objective because she's Muslim. The way people often will assume that her cultural frameworks as a Muslim person will influence her research in ways that make it less objective. But then we'll turn around and assume that other folks, like specifically white folks and atheists, will be able to, will somehow do this same research but without cultural assumptions, which is just not possible. Anyway, first problem with objectivity, people have bodies and are not disembodied eyes. Second problem is people rarely exist in a void of nothingness. Again, they have bodies. We can only know within the world, not from outside of it. Learning always happens in relationship and by interacting with other people and things. We are human. Science is always conducted by human beings, and alien species notwithstanding, and also my shark friend notwithstanding, but she's actually the object of knowledge, not the scientist, so it works. Sorry, I got distracted by shark friend. But in order to learn, right, we have to constantly be in relationship and interact with other people and things. As I said in previous classes as anthropologists, our main research tool is our body. And the last piece is that the subjects of research can talk back, and they will. It's knowledge isn't a one-way street. You've read examples of people, for example, reading books written about their community and taking issue with it. And that's, very common now. That's a very common phenomenon in our globalized world. And people in the community you work with may also be scholars, and they may critique what you're saying from a position of an academic, And so if objectivity doesn't work, how else can we think about knowing? What does it mean to know in a good way, right? Because objectivity isn't a reasonable framework doesn't mean all knowledge and all perspectives are equal. It doesn't mean that Joe Bobby, who's making conspiracy videos on YouTube, is just as worth listening to as a fucking nuclear physicist or something like that. That's not really a reasonable framework either, whatever reasonable means. Speaking of colonial constructs. But this is where bell hooks comes in and helps us, right? Because the way bell hooks thinks about knowledge, right, is she asks us to pay attention to social location. How is knowledge formed within particular social locations and within specific cultural frameworks? Other scholars talk about this in terms of standpoint or positionality. But I'm going to use these concepts, to talk about the underlying phenomenon, which is that we need to be able to account for the social locations or positions that shape how we know. We need to be able to account for the ways in which patriarchal ideologies shape our perspectives on human biology. And the ways in which these ideologies get reproduced, even in the realm of science. We need to be able to talk about so if people of color have been historically, and indigenous and black folks have been historically excluded and marginalized within academic settings, what does that do to knowledge, right? To mean that overwhelmingly social scientist and natural scientist perspectives have been about communicating, developing consensus and critiques within what was ultimately a very shared worldview and perspective rooted as white wealthy men. What happens when other people's perspectives are are brought to the center? How does that transform the ways we think about the world? And again, this is what Bell Hooks talks about as the privileged position of the margins, right? How does a perspective from the margins of systems of inequality, which she calls, again, capitalist patriarchy, white supremacy, but in a different order of those words, how does social locations from the margins of these systems actually give us a more profound and thorough perspective on the whole? And that's really an important move that's useful for anthropologists too, right? How does understanding the world from the perspective of marginalized peoples, from the perspective of people's immediate lives in an ethnographic sense, how does that give us a deeper and more profound and more robust and whole view of the whole of society, or the whole of the global systems that we're talking about? So an implication of this all, right, is that what I'm saying really is that knowledge is socially constructed and science is socially constructed. Because again, right, we're talking about humans doing it. It's an activity that humans do together in social relationships with one another. And it's shaped by categories and concepts and technologies that we use to understand the world. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong, right? Just because it's cultural doesn't mean it's bad or wrong. It's just a different way of thinking about these things. And it raises different kinds of questions, right? So social hierarchies can negatively affect scientific inquiry. And there's a few different ways that can happen. On the other hand, upending and destabilizing those hierarchies, centering our perspective from the margins, can really highlight the limitations of those dominant perspectives and help us create alternatives. So coming back to the egg and the sperm reading, how does a feminist critique help us deepen our understanding of biology, both on the level of scientific knowledge about the human body, as well as how our understanding of the process of how scientists produce knowledge? And this is really good science, right? Because unfortunately in high school they teach you that knowledge is just a bunch of things that you know and like you have to learn. But that's not what science is at all, right? Like science is an ongoing process of people working and making mistakes and trying to fix them and do a better job and critiquing each other. And it's always a work in progress. You know, we see this, of course, very clearly with the CDC's response to the pandemic. They revised their information because they got better data, because they were able to do more studies. And unfortunately, that shook a lot of people's faith in the CDC. But that's like the way science works, is it's a process. And it's not perfect. It's not a perfect way of knowing, it's just a powerful one. It has limitations and it has strengths. So again, just because I'm saying science is socially constructed, it's a social process, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It just helps us ask different kinds of questions and help us understand scientific process in a better way, right? It helps deepen our scientific literacy. Because if you treat science as just a bunch of pure knowledge, perfect knowledge that's just objective and true, well, that's a really, what's the word I'm looking for? That's a really fundamentalist perspective, in the sense of like a Christian fundamentalist believing in the literal word of God. That's a very fundamentalist perspective on science. And it doesn't help us, like what we don't see then is the actual process by which people know that knowledge. And if we can't understand by which people create knowledge, and if we can't understand the process, we can't really understand the knowledge very well, because we just take it to be true instead of understanding that all knowledge has limits and strengths, and it helps us understand some things but might obscure others. And that's what critical thinking is really about. That's what scientific literacy is really about. And the next piece, right, is there's no such thing as an unbiased perspective. It's not worth trying to be unbiased, right? That's probably too strong of a way of saying it. But an unbiased perspective doesn't exist, right? And it's not, like just because something is biased, I mean, of course, everything is biased, right? Because everything is located within social locations. And the thing, all knowledge is created within specific social locations and relationships. And the problem, right, is that when we talk about this language of biased and unbiased, we get tricked into thinking about this idea that there is something that exists, such as an unbiased perspective. But the problem is that what we take to be unbiased, really, it just means it reflects our cultural assumptions that we believed anyway. It reinforces our cultural assumptions and political assumptions. Whenever we think something is unbiased, it just means like we thought that was how it was beforehand anyway. It just reinforces our cultural frameworks and our view of the world. So a few frameworks, or like kinds of nice little word things, what's the word I'm looking for? Phrases that critical science studies, science and technology studies has really developed are things like this idea that research doesn't exist in a vacuum. This is a lovely phrase that helps us think about this problem, right? Is that researchers aren't in a vacuum. They're part of the world, and their work needs to be understood in terms of its larger social and cultural context. There's no neutral standpoint from which we can know the world. We can only know the world within it, and from within specific social locations, within larger social structures. And knowledge is always political. There's no such thing as apolitical or value-neutral knowledge. And the reason for that is because knowledge is always created and shaped within specific social relationships and power relationships. And again, whenever something is described as being political, what that means is it challenges, whenever somebody is critiqued for being too political in their analysis, usually what that means is that their perspective, their argument is rooted in a kind of politics that denaturalizes the business as usual politics, right? It might challenge white supremacy, and because it would demand people rethink their cultural expectations and assumptions, specifically white scientists in this example, it's seen as political in a way that the previous research, which was built on the systematic exclusion of Black, Indigenous, brown bodies, is seen as normal. So this idea that some knowledge is political and some is not is totally mystifying. It's a total illusion. And better science, to do good science, we need to not pretend these differences, these inequalities, these social processes don't exist. We need to be able to account for them and critique them. So here are my discussion questions. If there's something you're really itching to talk about that's not on one of these questions, go for it.